Welcome to the Vision Driven Marriage Podcast. If you're struggling in your marriage, or maybe you're wondering if it's even salvageable, before you give up or before you let things get too hard, let us come alongside you and help you solidify your marriage. We offer biblical encouragement and insight to help you strengthen your marriage. Hi, we're Doug and Leslie Davis, and we want to welcome you to the Vision Driven Marriage.
We want to invite you to an exciting new thing that we want to do. Generally, our podcasts are lined up where the first Friday of the month we have an interview followed by 3 episodes of teaching related to the topics in that interview. But that leaves us in a lurch for the 5th Friday. And so what we want to do in the next 5th Friday is answer any questions that you, the listener, might have. So what we've done is on the podcast page, we have set up a link for you guys to just submit any questions that you might have. So feel free to jump over to the website and submit a question, and we will answer your question on our 5th Friday episode.
And in today's episode, we want to address something that was in our interview episode with Jim and Mindy Bradford. Today, we want to look at complementarianism, specifically how complementarianism, when understood biblically, can be an asset in your marriage, how you and your spouse can come alongside one another in a way that will be a blessing to you as a couple, all through understanding this concept in a new way.
But the first thing that we need to do is define some of the words that are used, including complementarianism, but some of the words that are used around complementarianism that you might hear when you go to search that term or to look it up. So our first definition that we want to give to you is complementarianism. Now, complementarianism comes from the word complementary. I never say that word, right? Complementary. So that is when two things come together to make it complete or whole or perfect, I believe is the word that the dictionary.com uses. So 2 things come together to complete each other and make it perfect. And so that's the definition of complementarianism. Another definition that you'll want to know for sure as you're researching this or as you're looking this up is the definition of egalitarianism. Now, egalitarianism, for the most part, has the same premises as complementarianism, but the distinct difference is that egalitarianism goes as far into defining the roles that men and women have as equal. Thus the word egalitarianism. Complementarianism doesn't go as far as defining the same roles. Complementarianism is defined as a husband and a wife are equal but different.
That they have equal importance, equal value, but distinctly different callings. And when we look at a marriage, that's why we're going to be focusing on something that's not the theological difference. Leslie's going to explain a little more about what's going on, when you look up these terms in just a moment. But, one of the biggest differences is when we're looking theologically, which is what will come up the majority of the time when you search these terms. It'll say complementarianism is men and women have very distinctly different but of equal value roles. Egalitarianism says men and women have not only the same roles, that they can do any of the same things, but there's even been a not just a merging of the roles, but a swapping of gender roles.
And complementarianism has really been misunderstood and misused over, even these last 25 years, basically. And I think part of the reason that is why is because there's been such a pushback among women in our society against misogyny. Right. And the problem is that pushback against misogyny has the pushback isn't really against misogyny, but against the patriarchal hierarchy that we see kind of lined out in the Bible. And as we're pushing back against that patriarchal hierarchy, our hearts are really against the misogyny that that fuels it.
And you see, one of the things that I think is normal for human nature, but it can be a real danger for us, is to take something like misogyny. It's absolutely wrong. It should be stood up against every time, not just by women, but by men as well. And to assume then that every patriarchal hierarchy is then bad because misogyny exists. See, as we look at the tendencies, we need to make sure that we don't take the blessings that God's given to us, whether it's men or women, and turn it into a self-serving sin. Because misogyny won't exist when a man is surrendered to God, but it exists when he's surrendered to a self-serving nature. Just like, men, because there's a tendency toward dictatorship that could exist in some men, God's call is, to love the way Christ loved the church, to get rid of that thought. And, the other issue then is this just quiver when you hear the word submit, that also comes up in this argument. And because there's such a pushback against submit, the concepts get skewed. And the reality is this: all of us submit to something. You submit to traffic laws or you get a ticket. You submit to the laws of the country or you go to jail. Everybody submits to something. We're not really against submission. We're against the abuse of those who expect it. And I think one of the things that we need to become aware of, we just need to say it out loud, is that if men and women are both seeking God, then you don't see some of the things that cause us to bristle. But because it's easy for individuals to be self-serving rather than God-seeking, we do see abuses, misogyny. We see abuses. I won't surrender to anyone. I can do it all by myself. And none of us really believe in our hearts that any of that's true. So we should be looking at how this helps our marriage rather than getting caught up in the minutia of the argument.
Right. And complementarianism doesn't condone the patriarchal society that oppresses women.
Right.
Far from it.
Right.
Because complementarianism, in the structure of complementarianism, the husband and the wife should be complementing, like bringing together and making better the whole,
Right.
because of the things that they're bringing to the table. And by the things that I mean bringing to the table is like your gifts and your bents and the way that God made you, the way that God allows you to see things. Like, I believe that when God puts you with your spouse, that He chose that complement. He chose that person that makes your spouse whole.
Right.
And if you're one of those listeners that are saying, well, I wasn't following God when I married, I would say to you, that's okay. God is bigger than that.
Right.
God is bigger than that time, and He redeems those types of errors when we're not following the Lord in the way that we should. So don't just shut us off right now because you feel like during that time when you married that you weren't following the Lord, because
Right.
let me tell you, the Lord redeems those times.
Well, and not only that, when we look at complementarianism, one of the important things for us to grasp is that I bring my strengths, Leslie brings her strengths. She is naturally resilient in places that I'm not. She's naturally strong in places that I'm not because of the way that God has made her and wired her. And likewise, I'm naturally resilient, naturally strong in places that she's not. And so I bring what I have, she brings what she has. Together, we're able to be stronger than we can be apart. One way to look at it, even though this isn't a sponsor of the podcast, but you're welcome to if you'd like to, is when Reese's figured out to put peanut butter and chocolate together, the complementarianism of that is brilliant.
Beautiful. Yes.
And that's
It is
kind of what
beautiful.
we're looking for in a marriage.
But let me ask you, when you recognized that my strengths kind of coincided with your weaknesses, did that feel like an insult to you? Like, did that feel like a nudge or oh, that's just a calling out of your weakness?
No. See, as we get ready to start looking at how complementarianism will positively affect your marriage, men, I want to talk to you, but this is true for the women as well. Don't let this concept feel like an affront to you, because you are called for a purpose. You have things that you do well. And even if you struggle with self-esteem, please listen to this anyway. The things that your wife is able to do that make you better as a couple are not a challenge to you. They're not an affront to you. They are truly a help that will be a blessing to you individually, but more importantly, will be a blessing to you as a couple.
And I think it's like, I don't even know the name of the principle, but you know how when you bring two things together and the sum of those two things is greater than the whole?
The individual parts, yeah.
Right. That's what it's like when God brings together a couple and they begin to strengthen each other in those complemented areas. They are greater than the sum of their individual parts.
Right. And another thing for us to focus on is, I mentioned that we bristle when we see any abuses, but we also bristle when we think about, being a helper, because God has called us to help. And especially there's, some of you ladies I know struggle with the concept of being a helper. Men, I want you to hear this first. Ladies, I want you to hear this too. We have a false idea of what being a helper is. We think helper means assistant, aid, and by default, if you're the assistant, not the lead, then we in America think it's less than. We think it's inferior. By its very nature, complementarianism in a marriage recognizes that we're very different by God's design, but both equally valuable, just very different. And so don't think helper as in inferior. Instead, the same word that God uses to describe Eve as Adam's helper is the word that God uses to describe himself in Exodus 18:4, where God describes himself as Israel's helper. The word that he uses is Ezer, E-Z-E-R, and it's the same word that he uses to describe Eve as Adam's helper. What that means, God doesn't say, and of course God's not less than Israel. Of course God's not inferior to them. Instead, he was doing for them something that they couldn't do for themselves. And he refers to it as your helper. You needed help. I will provide that help for you. And that is the definition that God calls you to be a helper to your spouse, to do for them the things they can't do for themselves. And when we grasp that concept and realize that God in his design has given you a strength that will help come alongside your spouse's weakness to allow you to be blessed in a way you otherwise wouldn't be blessed, suddenly we realize this isn't about being inferior. This is about making everything better.
Yeah. And that is such an important point, because so often we get that wrong. We get that wrong in a marriage. And one of the things I know that does is that when that complementarianism atmosphere is nurtured or encouraged or strengthened, I know that can become a very solid, emotionally healing place that nurtures spiritual intimacy, it nurtures physical intimacy, it nurtures emotional intimacy. It is so much greater than what you would have just individually.
Right. Oh, it's absolutely true. And so as you start to think about the strengths that you have, start to think about the strength that you have being able to serve your spouse individually, but also the strengths that you have being able to bring those into the marriage relationship in such a way that as the two of you come together as one, making decisions, doing things, and functioning as a couple, what are the things that I'm bringing that are the blessing that makes this stronger than it would otherwise be? Be aware of them. Be conscious of them. And don't second guess yourself. Don't feel bad about them. Those are things that God wants you to use as the helper. Remember, he said to Israel, I will help you. I will do things for you that you couldn't do for yourself. What are the things that God's given you in your relationship that truly are a help when the two of you come together to make decisions, to do things, to function?
And I think that is a really important thing to look at too, but it's also important to look at the aspect of what is your spouse bringing, because both husbands and wife, both men and women, we have the opportunity to speak words of encouragement and words of kindness. And words of inspiration into those places where our spouse is bringing those things to the table. And I think that's where the power is at in fostering those things along, because when we're encouraging our spouse in those gifts that they're bringing to the table, it is encouraging them to bring those gifts some more. It is deepening the connection between the spouses. I know the time, at least for me personally, this is probably, and maybe this is because one of my love languages is words of encouragement. So I really feel loved when Doug is encouraging me, and I really feel loved when he's encouraging me in those gifts that I'm bringing to the table, because it makes me feel seen. It makes me feel heard, and it makes me feel important. So I would just encourage you to verbally speak praises into your spouse's life as you see the gifts that they're bringing to the table.
And so, again, both of those things are going to be important. Make sure you bring your strengths. Don't second guess yourself, but also recognize your spouse's strengths and acknowledge them. And so, some examples of both of those with when we face challenges, we could, because we've been given, by God's grace, we've been given intelligence, and we've been given His strength, and we've been given the things we need to be able to endure them individually if we needed to. But it's even better that He's given us one another, says that He sees us as one, and we get to meet those challenges together as a couple. And so because we get to meet those challenges together, one of the things that I'm able to bring if we're facing something that is going to be really difficult is, I get to bring just the reminder that it's going to be okay. We're strong. We can face this. God, God's with us. Leslie has this amazing ability to be able to see things from other people's perspective and to see things that I wouldn't recognize right away. Her instincts are quick to be able to do things that my instincts aren't quick to do. And so do you see how bringing both together is important? So if I remember, bring what God's given to me, don't balk at it, but then equally important, maybe even more important, men, I'll just go ahead again, I'll talk to you. When you recognize what your spouse brings, there's a couple of things your wife probably needs you to do. She needs you, first of all, to show the appreciation for what she's already doing, but also to acknowledge what she's doing. Now, that doesn't mean that you always agree. The beauty of being able to come together is that when we bring both sides, we're able to reason things through in a much more productive way. But it always should be acknowledged. Make sure you encourage her dreams, encourage her gifts, encourage what she's doing, and affirm her. Tell her what she's doing. That's something that I don't always do very well. Part of it, and this isn't an excuse at all, part of it is because I've never been the person that was affirmed or wanted to be affirmed. I don't think of it first like I should. And so we need to bring those things we don't think of first closer to the front of our minds. She is blessed when she's affirmed. I need to make sure that I'm continuing to affirm her. Then she's bringing her best to the table.
I think part of that, as it played out early on in our marriage, is that I worked hard not to be needy, because I'm not really a needy person, but I also knew that our schedules and our times and our bents and our life together just didn't facilitate being in a needy relationship. So we grew out of that and just kind of learned what kind of bents we were bringing to the table.
And are still learning.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Yes, we are still learning. And so, in fact, just getting ready for this podcast, we were learning.
Because a lot of times the way we communicate is one of those ways where we're very different. We've had episode after episode where we talked about this concept without using the words, because we can accomplish the same things, but we have a different starting point usually as men and women. And we have different gifts usually as men and women. There's always exceptions. Please don't think that just because something seems to be a natural tendency in others, that if you don't have that same natural tendency for compassion or that natural tendency for protection, that something's wrong. But because there are very strong differences between us, even communication occasionally needs to be rethought. For example, when I'm affirming my wife, very often I will share with her the general idea without the detail, and she would appreciate the detail. A good example is as I was watching her and the way she interacted with our young daughters. We have 4 daughters, and when she was interacting with them when they were young, I was able to see the beauty of it and to be able to tell her, "You're such a good mom. I love the way you treat the girl. I love that you're a good mom." What she would have benefited from even more is if I was able to share, the specifics of why. Because to her, the encouragement was good, but the affirmation in a specific area is even better. And so please understand this as we look at bringing our strengths and helping one another. Bring your own strengths, recognize what your spouse brings, and don't think that if you've done it if you've done it the way you'd consider it wrong, or if you think I haven't been doing this well enough, don't be discouraged. Just continue to bring your strengths and continue to recognize your spouse and grow through the process as you go. I'm pretty sure that, even into our very, very old age, we will continue to develop on how to do that better.
I think so. Yeah, absolutely. As we should. I mean, you should always continually be learning how to do things better, right? But I think one of the key points here is to understand that the strengths that you have are going to be different than your spouse's strengths. And that's God's intentional plan to make you complete couple as you grow together and learn how to use those strengths. But so often we have this mentality that, well, if you're different or if you're not like me, somehow that's wrong. Right. And I see that playing out in couples in the counseling office often, like, wanting one spouse wanting the other spouse to be more like them, and there's been authors that have written books about that. I mean, I have a book on my shelf entitled, "I Would Like You Better If You Were More Like Me." And
but would you really?
You're right,
You'd
exactly.
probably irritate each other.
You're right. It would be more problem than what that would be worth. And you would be losing a key part of the whole complementarianism point is that we make each other better.
Right. And so think about it in 3 different areas, though. There are very few separate commands from the Bible for men and women. And most of those are what we talked about earlier, to be able to get rid of selfish abuses. So God reins us in by saying, focus on my will. So, men, love your wives, wives, respect your husbands is one of the few separate commands for men and women. But then you've got these natural tendencies, these innate tendencies that make us very different. We get to the same finish point very often, but we have very different starting points the majority of the time. I'm really grateful that my wife is very caring and compassionate, that she sees things from other people's point of view, because I tend to be a problem solver who just jumps in. Now, believe it or not, those are both strengths, but could you imagine if I just jumped in with my strength of fixing it, but didn't take into consideration how anybody felt? Or on the flip side, if she jumped in recognizing how everybody felt but didn't have an immediate solution, but the combination of the two, do you see how it complements one another, where we are very much better together than we could be apart?
And when you talk about wives submitting to their husbands, let's just look at that scenario, right? Okay. So if I were to be in that scenario, and be concerned about how everybody feels, and become paralyzed, become decision paralyzed, because, ultimately taking in consideration how everybody feels, you're not going to find a solution that's going to be good for everybody, right? So then you become paralyzed, decision paralyzed, not being able to make a decision on what's good in that situation. And that's why we submit to our husbands, because we can say, look, this is going to affect this person this way. This is going to affect this person this way. It's going to affect this person this way. So those are all of that. That's all of the facts, but you need to make a decision.
But that only happens in a healthy way when me as the husband is listening to you.
Absolutely.
And see, that's again, the complementarianism part of it. Also includes not only the decision fatigue could paralyze, but something else that's important. Men, your wife needs to know, with certainty, she needs to be able to have faith in the fact that she's heard, that And again, that doesn't mean you have to agree. Please understand that somebody hearing you doesn't mean they do what you say. But knowing that you're heard is powerful and beautiful, and it's something that will bless you considerably. And so you need to understand that, if I jumped in and just did what I was good at, let's fix it, I wouldn't consider how it was going to affect people, and I could do damage. And likewise, Leslie just described some of the places where she could fall short. But knowing that my wife is going to be heard allows her the freedom to know that she can speak. Knowing that she has the freedom that she will speak is an encouragement and a blessing to me, because now we realize it's not going to be one of those things afterwards that she didn't tell me what she saw and instead feels like she wants to say, I told you so. Instead, she knows she should and will share with me what she sees that I don't see. And complementarianism works as a blessing in that way. Now, we talked about there's a few differences in the scripture between what men and women are told to do, and there's a few natural tendencies that are different. But I also want to encourage you in a way that Leslie already mentioned it. I just want to say it again. There are going to be personal strategies in your marriage that are different between you as a husband and you as a wife that don't necessarily fall into the biblical differences or the natural tendencies that are different. There's something that's unique to you. They're unique to your situation. They're unique to your family, unique to your time schedule, whatever it is. Please don't think that because there's something going on in your marriage that allows you as the husband to do this because it's the right fit, but other husbands don't, that somehow that's wrong. Because there are going to be things about every marriage that are unique to you. It's one of those beautiful things that God took you as a husband and you as a wife and put you together, not two other people. He put you together. So there will be a couple of things that will be unique to you. Don't convince yourself to feel bad about that.
Right. Case in point, it may be perfectly fine with a couple who has a stay-at-home dad and a working mom. Given the scenarios, I know a couple of couples that are like that, and that works. That's not because the mom or the wife is the provider in the family. That's not anti-biblical,
Yeah. And we see it in areas that often aren't seen by anybody else. For example, if one of you is much more comfortable being the one who drops a child off at daycare, just because the other families in your neighborhood, it's the mom who's doing it. If in your marriage it works out better where everybody's happier, child's happier, dad's happier, mom's happier when dad drops them off, that's okay. Or if one of the two of you is the one who doesn't go through the anxiety doing bill paying, be the one that does that. Because those aren't things that are specific or even natural tendency, male, female things. There's things in your relationship that you're going to be able to see you can complement one another, because this is something I'm strong at. This is something that I can help you with. And remember, helping in God's term, something you can't do, so I'm going to do this for you.
An example in our relationship, in our household, Doug does 90% of the cooking. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I like that because, one, I'm not that great of a cook, and two, he's a really good cook.
But what we found out, and we don't, we would never say that with any task or even any emotion that you should fall into that's the
stereotype,
husband.
Right.
Because there are a few things that God says are for men and for women. Those are for men or for women. The Bible is true, should never be changed. But the majority of what we do is something that's a natural tendency because of the way God's wired us. First of all, recognize your spouse's gifts and encourage them. Mm-hmm. Bring your strengths to the table. But then there's things in your marriage that are going to be unique to you as well. And don't be afraid to figure out, in our marriage, with this thing that isn't a natural tendency and it's not a biblical command, who's going to be able to do this in a way that complements the other so that we can be stronger as a couple?
Exactly.
And so the concept of complementarianism too often becomes something that becomes a theological debate, but in the marriage relationship, looking at complementarianism is understanding God's purpose for marriage, understanding that He brings us together for a purpose, that we're better together than we could ever be apart, that the two will become one, and of course, you need to have Christ in the center as two become one.
And the complementarianism is an outcropping of a husband and a wife being submitted to the Lord.
Yes.
It happens naturally. It's not going to be something that we have to work at when we're both submitted to the Lord. So, hey, I want to give you listeners a heads up on next week's podcast. We get the awesome privilege of talking to Ron and Haley Wood about trauma responses in relationships. It's going to be a really good episode. You're not going to want to miss it.
And so we want to thank you for joining us today as we talked about complementarianism in the marriage and how God will strengthen us together as we seek to solidify your marriage.